Welcome back to Sleepy Town Radio, where the nights are slow, the stories are gentle, and the past feels close enough to touch. Maybe tonight, you're lying there with the world still turning a little too fast, and you're looking for something quieter, a place where time unravels like an old country road, winding back toward a home that might still live in your memory. For me, that road always begins in the back of a station wagon. Picture it. A warm summer evening. Long shadows stretching across the pavement. The sun is dipping low, tinting the sky in honey and rose. The air hums with the lazy rhythm of crickets somewhere beyond the tree line. You're a kid again, leaning back into a wide bench seat that faces the world behind you. Every mile pulls the scenery away. Telephone poles slipping into the distance. Headlights of passing cars catching your eye. You and your brothers or sisters make faces at strangers in the cars that follow, giggling at the ones who play along. It's more than a ride home. It's a moving piece of America's story. That station wagon wasn't just a car. It was the heart of family life for decades. It carried Sunday groceries and camping gear, sleepy children and wet bathing suits, Christmas trees tied with scratchy rope, and maps unfolded on the dashboard. Once, they were everywhere. From coast to coast, these long, low silhouettes with their wood panel sides and endless windows were the silent witnesses to our growing up. They sat in every driveway, waited in every school pickup line, rumbled down every interstate when summer vacation began, and yet, somewhere along the way, they slipped quietly out of our lives. You might have noticed it. One year, there were fewer parked on the street. Another year, you couldn't remember the last time you'd seen a new one. Today, they feel almost like a dream, a memory that belonged to a certain time, a certain America. Tonight, we're going to follow their road from the very beginning. We'll go back to when they weren't even called station wagons yet, when they stood at train depots, waiting to haul passengers and luggage into town. We'll ride through their golden years, see what made them an icon, and understand why they faded away. So settle in and let the hum of memory take the wheel. The road ahead is long, but it's a road worth traveling. If you trace the station wagon back far enough, you don't find highways or suburb driveways. You find train tracks. At the turn of the 20th century, America was stitched together by rail. If you needed to go from one city to another, the train was your lifeline. You'd board under the arched roof of a bustling depot, sit in a wooden coach car for hours or even days, and finally step down onto the platform in a new town, the air carrying a different scent, the light falling at a different angle, but the journey didn't end at the station. You still needed to get yourself, and often a staggering pile of luggage, from the depot to wherever home or hotel happened to be. And this is where the earliest ancestors of the station wagon came in. Vehicles known back then as depot hacks. The word hack was just an old term for a taxi. And these depot hacks were exactly that, taxis for train travelers. But they weren't sleek sedans or finely appointed carriages. They were workhorses, built on truck frames, often with solid wooden sides, a bench or two bolted into the back, and a generous space behind them for trunks, hat boxes, and battered leather suitcases. In those early years, automobiles themselves were still a novelty. In 1909, there were more than 500 car manufacturers scattered across the United States, many of them tiny workshops turning out just a handful of vehicles a year. Each depot hack could look a little different because so many were hand-built. You might see one in Chicago with finely varnished oak panels, brass fittings catching the sunlight, and then find a rougher cousin in some rural stop. Its pine boards nailed together by a local craftsman who cared more about utility than style. Henry Ford's Model T, introduced in 1908, changed everything. By 1910, Ford had the radical idea of selling the Model T as a bare chassis. No body, just the frame, engine, wheels, and steering. Priced at $700, it was within reach for small companies to buy and customize, and that's exactly what they did. All across America, body shops and carpenters' guilds turned these chassis into depot hacks. They built wooden bodies tall enough for passengers to sit comfortably, with open sides or roll-down curtains for bad weather, and sturdy floors to bear the weight of luggage. In a way, these vehicles were already carrying the DNA of the station wagon, part passenger transport, part cargo hauler, endlessly adaptable to the needs of the day. They weren't designed for speed. They were designed for service. Picture a scene from 1915. A passenger train has just arrived in a small Midwestern town. The platform is busy. Men in wool suits, women in long skirts and wide-brimmed hats, children clutching tin lunch pails. Off to the side, a line of depot hacks waits in the dusty road, their horses long since replaced by chugging gasoline engines. The drivers lean against their fenders, caps pulled low, calling out to arriving travelers. A porter hauls a steamer trunk toward one of the hacks, setting it down with a thud before helping a weary family climb aboard. The ride from the station might only be a mile or two, but for those passengers, it was the first glimpse of their destination. The brick storefronts, the church steeple, the houses with wide porches. And for the driver, it was just another circuit in a day that might see 100 faces come and go. Nobody called them station wagons yet. That name wouldn't stick until the 1920s, when passenger cars began to adopt the form and purpose of these workaday hacks. But the seed was planted here, in the practical, unglamorous job of bridging the gap between the steel rails and someone's front door. There was something honest about them. No chrome to polish, no hood ornaments to show off, just solid wheels, a rattling engine, and a body built to do a job. Yet, as we'll see, that humble role was exactly what made them so indispensable, and what set the stage for their transformation into one of America's most beloved vehicles. From here, the story shifts. As the country changed, as roads spread out like veins and the automobile became less a novelty and more a necessity, the depot hack would evolve. It would trade its open sides for enclosed cabins, its strictly functional build for touches of style, and its image from a station taxi to a family companion. But before any of that could happen, it had to take one more step, becoming the station wagon in name as well as in spirit. And that's where we're headed next. By the early 1920s, America was changing. Roads, once little more than rutted dirt paths, were being paved. Cars were no longer rare sights in towns. They were becoming part of the landscape, sharing space with horse-drawn wagons and the occasional streetcar. The country was starting to move in a new way, and somewhere in that transition, the depot hack, that humble workhorse of the train station, began to evolve. Nobody wrote the date down in stone, but somewhere between 1923 and 1929, the shape and the purpose of those vehicles shifted enough that people started calling them something new. The station wagon. It's a simple name when you think about it. A wagon that serves the station. But by the end of the decade, the term meant more than that. It hinted at a car that could do two jobs: carry passengers comfortably and haul whatever needed hauling. And it suggested a certain lifestyle, one where travel wasn't just about getting from here to there, but about having the freedom to bring a little more of your world along with you. In 1929, Ford introduced something that would seal the name in place: the Model A station wagon. Built with handsome wooden panels and a roofline that hinted at both utility and elegance, it was the first wagon from one of America's big three automakers. For many Americans, it was their first time seeing a wagon not as a converted truck, but as a purpose-built vehicle, designed from the start for the mix of family and cargo that defined the breed. A few years later, in 1935, Chevrolet took a bold step forward. They built a station wagon entirely out of steel. It was a move ahead of its time: strong, durable, weather-resistant. And yet, strangely, the public didn't rush to embrace it. People loved the look of real wood. A wooden body, with its rich grain and warm finish, suggested craftsmanship, expense, and even a certain prestige. Steel, no matter how practical, couldn't quite match the romance of polished maple and ash. Through the 1930s, woody wagons became status symbols in their own right. They were more expensive than many sedans and coupes, and owning one said something about you. They were the choice of resorts that ferried guests from train platforms to grand hotel lobbies, of well-to-do families who summered by the shore, of country estates that needed a vehicle as refined as it was useful. If you close your eyes, you can almost see it. A 1938 Ford Woody wagon pulling up in front of a hotel with a wraparound porch, its varnished panels glowing in the late afternoon sun. The driver hops down to unload trunks while children tumble out in knickers and dresses, the salty smell of the ocean drifting in from just beyond the dunes. The car itself becomes part of the picture, not just a means of arrival, but an unmistakable part of the setting. Still, that beauty came with burdens. Real wood demanded care. Owners had to oil the panels, check for rot, and tighten joints just to keep them from warping or splitting. The upkeep was as much a part of ownership as changing the oil in the engine. But at this stage in the story, no one minded. The Woody's elegance was worth the trouble, and its presence on the road was something to admire. This was the moment when the station wagon truly found its identity. It had stepped beyond the depot yard and into everyday life, not just as a hauler of passengers from train to town, but as a versatile, desirable part of the American road. The seeds of its golden age had been planted, and as the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, that identity would only grow stronger. Ford, never content to leave an opportunity unexplored, opened its own dedicated wagon body plant in Iron Mountain, Michigan. Using timber from forests the company itself owned, they built wagon bodies in-house and shipped them to assembly plants across the continent. It was a sign of how important this vehicle had become, and of the demand that was waiting to be met. The birth of the station wagon was more than the start of a new type of car. It was the beginning of a love affair between America and the idea of a vehicle that could carry both the people we love and the life we're building. A car that wasn't afraid to get a little dirty on a camping trip, but looked just as at home parked in front of the nicest house on the block. It was still young, still finding its place in the world, but the road ahead was opening wide. And in the next chapter of our journey, we'll watch as the woody wagon, beautiful, temperamental, and utterly iconic, becomes a fixture of American dreams. By the mid-1930s, the station wagon had found its form, and it was beautiful. It wasn't the kind of beauty you'd see in a showroom under bright lights. This was something warmer, more alive. These were the woody wagons, cars whose bodies were framed and paneled in real wood, polished until they glowed like fine furniture. You didn't just see them. You could almost feel the grain under your fingertips, smell the faint scent of varnish when the sun warmed the panels. For a moment in history, wood wasn't a compromise. It was a luxury. In an era before steel stamping took over every corner of the industry, real wood was a mark of craftsmanship. Resorts used them to ferry guests from train platforms to grand hotels. Country estates kept one parked by the barn for weekend trips into town. And families who could afford it chose a woody wagon as both a practical hauler and a subtle announcement of their standing. Ford, always a master of scale, made wood-bodied wagons a serious business. In 1936, they opened their own wagon body plant in Iron Mountain, Michigan, not just assembling, but actually harvesting the wood themselves. Ford owned vast forests in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, rich with maple, birch, and basswood. Workers cut the timber, cured it, and shaped it into panels right there in the plant. Those bodies were then shipped to assembly lines across North America, ready to be mounted to a waiting chassis. The result was something truly striking. Each car a little different, because no two pieces of wood were ever exactly the same. Some had a deep, honeyed tone that caught the evening light. Others carried a cooler shade, the grain swirling in patterns you could follow like a fingerprint. But beauty came with a price, and not just in dollars. Real wood is alive in a way steel never is. It swells in damp weather, shrinks in heat, and if neglected, it will split, warp, or rot. Owners of woody wagons knew this well. Keeping one in good condition was closer to caring for a wooden sailboat than for an ordinary car. You had to oil the joints, tighten the bolts, refinish the panels every year or two. Left alone, the elements would take their toll quickly. It was work, sometimes tedious, often costly, but for many, it was worth it. Part of the appeal was the ritual itself. On a warm Saturday morning, you might see a father and his teenage son in the driveway, sleeves rolled up, rubbing linseed oil into the wood, their hands moving in slow, practiced circles. The smell would hang in the air all day, a quiet promise that the wagon was ready for another season of use. These wagons weren't just machines. They were part of the household, like a porch swing or a well-worn dining table. They carried camping gear and fishing poles, boxes of groceries, luggage strapped to the roof rack. They went to church on Sunday, to the lake in July, to the neighbor's barn dance in October, and when you saw one coming down the road, it was hard not to turn your head. The combination of steel fenders, curved glass, and gleaming wood sides made them stand out in a way no other vehicle could. Even people who never owned one seemed to admire them. Still, the very qualities that made them beautiful also pointed toward their eventual end. By the late 1940s, as car ownership expanded and more families entered the market, the cost and upkeep of real wood became harder to justify. But for now, in this window between the Depression and the post-war boom, the Woody wagon reigned as an icon of both style and substance. If you close your eyes, you can still picture one parked in front of a white clapboard house, the late afternoon sun slanting through the trees, casting golden light across its panels, the smell of cut grass in the air, the sound of a screen door slamming, and the promise of a drive anywhere, as long as the road was open. It was an era when a family car could be a piece of art, and when owners were willing to work to keep it that way. Next, the story will shift. America will step out of the shadow of war, and the wagon will change again, swapping real wood for the illusion of it, and trading craftsmanship for durability. The Woody, for all its beauty, was about to pass the torch. By the time the Second World War ended, America was ready to move forward. Soldiers came home, cities pulsed with new energy, and the country turned its eyes to the open road. Families were growing, suburbs were spreading, and the automobile was more essential than ever before. For the station wagon, it was a moment of transformation, a shift that would carry it from the craftsmanship of the past into the durability of the modern age. In 1946, Willys, the same company that had built the rugged Jeeps for the military, introduced something new: the Willys Jeep Station Wagon. It was a revelation. Built entirely from steel, it promised strength, longevity, and freedom from the constant upkeep that had come with real wood panels. And yet, Willys knew the public wasn't ready to let go of the charm of wood entirely, so they painted faux wood grain along the sides, offering the look people loved, without the headaches of oiling and refinishing every year. It was a clever bridge between eras, and it worked. Buyers liked the idea of something that could still look like a Woody wagon, but didn't demand a carpenter's care. The Willys wagon wasn't just practical, it was rugged and versatile, as comfortable in a suburban driveway as it was bumping down a dirt road to a lakeside cabin. Just 3 years later, in 1949, Plymouth made the move that truly signaled the future: the Plymouth Suburban. It was an all-steel wagon with no real wood at all, not even the structural kind. The Suburban was handsome, streamlined, and solid. For the first time, a family could own a wagon that offered the space and utility they wanted, without the high cost and maintenance of wood construction, and Americans embraced it. In the years that followed, other manufacturers followed Plymouth's lead, phasing out real wood entirely. By the mid-1950s, genuine wood-bodied wagons were gone from the market. In their place came durable steel bodies dressed with vinyl decals that mimicked the look of wood grain. It was a visual nod to tradition, a kind of nostalgia built right into the paintwork, but it was also a metaphor for the times. America was moving toward speed, convenience, and mass production. The vinyl wood grain said, "I've made it," without asking for a weekend of sanding and varnishing. Still, for all the practical advantages, there was a certain sadness to it. Real wood had given each wagon a unique character, a warmth that metal could only imitate. The new steel wagons were stronger, cheaper, easier to produce, but they were also more uniform, more predictable. The artistry of handcrafted panels was replaced by the clean efficiency of the assembly line. Yet, for the families of the late 1940s and 1950s, this was progress. A steel-bodied wagon meant fewer worries about weather, less time in the garage, and more time on the road. It was the perfect companion for the expanding suburban lifestyle, loading the kids for a drive-in movie, packing the back with groceries for the week, or pointing the hood toward the beach on a bright Saturday morning. If you imagine a Plymouth Suburban parked in a driveway in 1950, you might see a tidy little ranch house with a fresh coat of white paint, a neatly clipped lawn, and the smell of coffee drifting from an open kitchen window. The wagon waits patiently, chrome catching the sunlight, ready for the next outing. It's not a piece of furniture anymore. It's a machine built for the modern American family. In many ways, this transition to steel was the start of the wagon's golden age. The durability opened the door for more ambitious designs, bigger models, and bolder features in the decades to come. The wagon was no longer just a bridge from the train station to home. It was becoming the very heart of the family's travels. But even as the wood wagons faded into memory, their spirit lived on in the vinyl panels and long roof lines of these new steel successors. The Plymouth Suburban wasn't just a practical step forward. It was a statement. The station wagon had arrived in the modern world, and it was here to stay. Next, America's love affair with the station wagon would catch fire. The post-war boom, the birth of the suburbs, and the baby boom would turn this once humble vehicle into an icon of the American dream. The years after the Second World War brought a kind of change America had never seen before. The war was over, the soldiers were home, and the country seemed to breathe out all at once, exhaling years of worry and ration books into something lighter, something hopeful. New houses began to rise on land that just a few years earlier had been open fields or farmland. Rows of ranch-style homes stretched out into the distance, each with a small front lawn, a driveway, and a young tree planted near the curb. These weren't the crowded city blocks of the old neighborhoods. This was something different. A promise of space, of safety, of a place where children could ride their bikes until the streetlights came on. And at the center of it all, waiting quietly in that driveway, was the station wagon. It was as if this new America had been built with the wagon in mind. The expanding highway system, funded by the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, made the country feel suddenly closer together. Families could pile into the car and, in just a few hours, be somewhere entirely new. The shore, the mountains, a cousin's house in another state. The timing couldn't have been better. The post-war baby boom was in full swing. Families were bigger, louder, more active than ever before. 3, 4, even 5 children wasn't unusual, and all those kids, along with the dogs, picnic baskets, and baseball gloves, needed space to travel. The station wagon provided it. In 1950, wagons made up less than 3% of all cars sold in America. But as the suburbs spread and the baby boom swelled, that number began to climb, reaching 17% by 1958. It was no longer just a vehicle. It was the family's mobile home base. On a Saturday morning in 1957, you might have seen it parked out front, tailgate open, the back already loaded with folding chairs, a cooler, maybe a rolled-up canvas tent. Dad would be tying down the last of the gear while Mom packed sandwiches and wax paper inside. Kids darted in and out, arguing over who got the way back seat, the one that faced backward and made the world rush away behind them. For many families, the wagon became the memory keeper. It was there for the Sunday drive after church, when the family would roll the windows down and let the wind carry the smell of fresh-cut grass through the cabin. It was there for the summer vacation road trip, 2 full days to Grandma's house, with roadside diners, tourist traps, and the occasional "Are we there yet?" from the back seat. And it was there for the ordinary days, too. The morning drop-offs at school. The grocery runs where bags of flour and cartons of milk slid gently in the back. The late-night rides home from a baseball game. Kids nodding off one by one as the tires hummed against the pavement. The station wagon fit this moment in America because it reflected the values of the time. It was practical, but comfortable. Modest, yet big enough to carry the whole family, and then some. It wasn't about showing off, though some models certainly turned heads, but about having the freedom to go where you wanted, with everyone you loved right there beside you. It's hard to think of another vehicle so perfectly matched to its era. In those years, there was a sense that the future was wide open. The country was building, expanding, dreaming, and the station wagon was part of that dream. A long, low symbol of movement and possibility. Even now, if you close your eyes, you might be able to picture it. A 1950s driveway, the morning sun catching the chrome trim, the smell of coffee from the kitchen, and the muffled laughter of kids climbing in for another day's adventure. Out on the street, other wagons idle, neighbors waving as engines start, and the whole neighborhood seems to move together toward a shared horizon. This was the station wagon's moment. The years when America was young again, when the road was an invitation, and when family life seemed to fit perfectly within the long, gleaming frame of a car built for togetherness. By the late 1960s, the American station wagon had grown, not just in popularity, but in size, ambition, and personality. If the wagons of the 1950s were practical family companions, the wagons of the late 60s were proud, sprawling statements on wheels. The Ford Country Squire of 1968, for example, stretched over 19 feet from bumper to bumper, longer than many of today's SUVs. Standing beside it, you couldn't help but notice the sheer scale. The hood seemed to run on forever. The roofline carried over 3 full rows of seats, and the tailgate stood like the back door to a moving house. These weren't simply cars anymore. They were land yachts. Sliding into one felt like stepping into a traveling living room. Plush bench seats, upholstered in soft cloth or vinyl, invited you to sink in and stay a while. Wide windows surrounded you, letting in ribbons of sunlight and views of whatever scenery rolled past. The dashboard, often trimmed with imitation wood grain, stretched wide enough to feel like a piece of furniture. Families loved them for the space. 3 rows meant parents up front, a couple of kids in the middle, and, perhaps most coveted of all, the way back seat in the rear. That rear-facing bench turned every trip into a private adventure for the children lucky enough to claim it. They'd wave at the drivers behind, make faces at truckers, or lose themselves in license plate bingo while the road stretched endlessly ahead. From the outside, the wood grain paneling, by now a printed vinyl, not the real thing, became a signature. It was less about authenticity and more about the image it projected. The imitation wood was a nod to tradition, a symbol that this was a family car with roots, with heritage. And it worked. pulling into the church parking lot or the local ball field in a wood-paneled country Squire or Chevy Kingswood spoke volumes. It said you were part of that new suburban America, stable, comfortable, moving confidently into the future. In those days, the wagon status wasn't about speed or luxury in the way a sports car or Cadillac might be. Its prestige came from its role. It was the car that could carry the whole baseball team to an away game. It could haul the plywood for Dad's weekend project, or the folding tables for the neighborhood block party. It was the car you could load with sleeping bags and head for the mountains without a second thought. The sheer size of these machines was matched by their presence on the road. With big V8 engines under the hood, they cruised down the highway with a kind of quiet authority. Even at 70 miles per hour, they felt steady, almost unshakable. The long wheelbase soaked up bumps, and the weight gave them a sense of permanence, as if they weren't just driving over the land, but owning it. For a child in the back, the experience was unforgettable. You'd watch the world slide past in panoramic frames, farms giving way to towns, towns fading into stretches of open road. Sometimes, on long trips, you'd stretch out on the back seat, lulled to sleep by the low hum of the tires and the occasional click of the turn signal. It's funny now to think of them as practical, but in the context of the 1960s, they were. Gas was cheap, parking lots were big, and the pace of life seemed to welcome a vehicle this large. They fit neatly into an era of abundance, of big families, big meals, and big plans for the future. Looking back, the land yacht wagons were as much cultural symbols as they were modes of transportation. They embodied a certain confidence, the idea that the open road was yours to explore, that there was room for everyone, and that no destination was too far. They were the car for a country that felt like it was still expanding, still dreaming, and even though they've all but disappeared, the image lingers. A long, wood-paneled wagon gleaming in the afternoon sun, kids tumbling out with a baseball glove in one hand and a soda in the other, parents laughing by the tailgate. It's a picture of a time when bigger really did seem better, and when the family car wasn't just a way to get somewhere. It was a place where life happened. If the late 60s and early 70s gave us the grand land yachts, then this was the era when the station wagon truly became more than just a vehicle. It was a stage for family life, a traveling canvas on which countless small moments were painted. Most of those moments weren't spectacular. They weren't the kind of things anyone would write down in a diary or pose for in a photograph. But together, they were the threads that wove the fabric of a family's story. Picture a Saturday morning in midsummer. The back of the wagon is open, the tailgate dropped flat like a front porch in miniature. Dad is loading the cooler, the heavy kind, with metal clasps and a handle that always seemed to pinch your fingers. Mom is making sure the sleeping bags are tucked in tight, a grocery sack full of snacks sitting nearby. The kids are already claiming seats before the trip has even begun. On the road, the wagon settled into its role effortlessly. Up front, the parents kept a quiet rhythm. One hand on the wheel, one on the map, a coffee thermos resting between them. The hum of the tires filled the pauses in conversation. In the middle seat, the kids might be swapping comic books or arguing over who got the bigger half of a sandwich. Someone would inevitably ask, "Are we there yet?" Long before they should have. And way in the back, the magical Way back, the rear-facing seat turned the world into something entirely different. Looking out that window, you didn't just watch the scenery pass. You watched it retreat. Small towns, roadside diners, and gas stations all slipped quietly into the distance as the wagon carried you forward. Long trips had their rituals. License plate bingo was a favorite, spotting plates from as many different states as possible before the day was over. Sometimes it was just simple games, counting red cars, waving at truck drivers, making silly faces at kids in the car behind you. And there were the smells, a strange, comforting mix of vinyl seats warmed by the sun, peanut butter sandwiches, and whatever faint hint of motor oil seemed to live in the carpet no matter how many times it was vacuumed. Camping trips were their own kind of magic. The wagon would pull up to the campsite like a trusty mule that had carried everything on its back. Out came the tent poles, the folding chairs, the lanterns. When night fell, the tailgate became a dinner table, or a seat for stargazing, or the perfect place to sit and listen to the crickets. Even the everyday errands had a rhythm to them. Driving to Grandma's house on a Sunday afternoon, the wagon loaded with pies in the back and kids in their Sunday best, was as much a part of family life as dinner at the kitchen table. The drive home afterward with the sun low in the sky and the kids dozing against the windows felt safe, familiar, almost timeless. Sports practice, too, revolved around the wagon. The back could swallow up an entire little league team's worth of bats, gloves, and duffel bags. On chilly mornings, the kids would pile in wearing sweatshirts, the smell of leather mitts and fresh-cut grass filling the air. Somehow, all that space meant more than just cargo room. It meant possibility. You could take along a neighbor's kid, or decide to stop for ice cream on a whim, or pull over when you spotted a roadside fruit stand. The wagon was flexible, ready for whatever the day threw at it, and perhaps that was the real beauty of it. It wasn't just a car. It was a setting, a moving backdrop against which so much life played out. Arguments and laughter, quiet moments and noisy ones, new adventures and familiar routines. All of it happened within those 4 doors and that long wood-paneled body. Today, you can still find old photographs of those moments. A family gathered around the open tailgate, paper plates balanced on their laps. Kids leaning out of the rear window, hair blown wild by the wind. A dog asleep on the folded-down back seat after a long day at the lake. The American station wagon was never just about getting from one place to another. It was about the time in between, the shared miles, the in-between conversations, the little traditions that no one planned but everyone remembered. It was the sound of a turn signal clicking on a quiet 2-lane road, the way the rear window framed the fading light, the gentle sway as you rounded a curve and headed toward home. In those days, the journey wasn't something you endured. It was part of the experience. And in the warm, sprawling embrace of a station wagon, that experience was nothing short of home on wheels. Beyond their role as family haulers, American station wagons carried a quiet kind of ingenuity. They were more than just long cars with extra seats. They were exercises in problem solving, in making a vehicle as versatile as the lives it served. And perhaps nowhere was that more evident than in the way engineers approached the back of the car, the tailgate, the The tailgate wasn't just a door. It was a gateway into family trips, Little League seasons, camping adventures, and grocery runs. Automakers experimented with almost every imaginable configuration, each one trying to make life just a little easier. Some wagons featured the traditional drop-down tailgate, sturdy enough to hold the weight of 2 kids and a golden retriever. Others had a split design that swung open sideways, like the doors of a barn, making it easier to load when space was tight. Then there was the clamshell tailgate, an engineering curiosity that has never really been repeated. In models like the Chevrolet Kingswood and the Oldsmobile Custom Cruiser, the rear glass slid up into the roof while the lower half disappeared neatly under the floor. With nothing left in the way, you could walk right up to the cargo area without lifting or swinging a thing. For families unloading coolers or suitcases in the rain, it felt like magic, and the creativity didn't stop there. Buick's Skylark wagons and the Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser introduced roof designs that felt almost futuristic. The Vista Cruiser's raised rear roofline allowed for extra headroom in the back, while its fixed glass panels along the sides and roof poured sunlight into the cabin. On a summer road trip, it was like riding in a moving conservatory, the clouds drifting overhead, the treetops rushing by. Some wagons borrowed from the world of luxury sedans, adding clever fold-flat rear seats that transformed them into makeshift moving vans. Others offered hidden compartments beneath the cargo floor, perfect for stowing tools, blankets, or a secret stash of snacks. Engineers understood that a family car had to be more than comfortable. It had to be adaptable. Even small details reflected that thinking. The rear windows on many wagons could roll down, either manually with a crank or later with the press of a button. That meant a breeze on warm days and a quick escape route for camping gear. The tailgate glass, in particular, was a point of pride, a piece of engineering that made the wagon stand out from sedans and coupes. These features weren't just mechanical conveniences. They shaped the way families used their cars. A drop-down tailgate became a seat for watching fireworks or parades. A clamshell opening turned the wagon into an impromptu picnic table. Those panoramic glass roofs turned a simple drive into an event, letting you see the world in a way you never could from the back seat of an ordinary car. Looking back now, there's a kind of poetry to the way these designs were both practical and playful. The engineers weren't just solving problems. They were anticipating moments. They knew that parents needed a way to haul lumber from the hardware store, but they also knew a tailgate had to be strong enough for kids to sit on while eating popsicles. They knew cargo space had to fit a week's worth of groceries, but they also knew it might hold fishing poles, Christmas trees, or a science fair project too big for the school bus. In the quiet pride of those designs, you can see an era when cars were crafted not just to move people, but to fit their lives. The station wagon, with its clever doors, its airy glass panels, and its chameleon-like adaptability, was an everyday marvel, the kind of engineering that never shouted, but always showed up when you needed it. And in that way, these wagons weren't just built to carry cargo. They were built to carry memories. Beneath the long, flat hoods of America's great station wagons was a kind of quiet confidence, the steady heartbeat that made those miles roll by with ease. It wasn't about racing or showing off. These cars weren't muscle cars, though many shared the same mechanical DNA. They were built for something more enduring, the promise that no matter how far the road stretched, the engine would carry you there, mile after mile. In the golden years, most wagons left the factory with V8 engines, not timid ones, but big-bore, high-torque power plants designed to haul the weight of a fully loaded car, the luggage, the camping gear, and perhaps a small trailer hitched behind. There was something reassuring about that deep, steady rumble when you turned the key. It didn't shout. It didn't need to. It was the sound of capability, of knowing the car could handle whatever you asked of it. Gas was cheap then. Highways were open and wide. The national speed limit was often just a suggestion to be nudged when the road was clear. On summer road trips, the big V8s settled into a low, steady hum, the kind that lulled kids to sleep in the back seat while the world outside blurred into rolling fields and fading light. Acceleration was never the main goal, but it was there when you needed it. Press the pedal a little harder, and that long hood would rise, the car surging forward with smooth, unhurried strength. It wasn't the kind of speed that pinned you to your seat, more like a steady push, as if the car itself had decided, yes, we can get around this truck, and we'll do it without fuss. And while the horsepower figures might sound modest by today's standards, in their time, they were more than enough. Engines like Ford's 390 cubic inch V8 or Chevrolet's small block 350 became legends in their own right, remembered not just for their output, but for their reliability. Families trusted these machines the way you might trust a strong horse, dependable, steady, and willing to work all day without complaint. Of course, with that kind of power came appetite. Many wagons returned just 10 or 12 miles to the gallon, and on long trips, gas stops became part of the ritual. The father would pull up to the pump, maybe check the oil while the tank filled, while the kids stretched their legs or grabbed a soda from the vending machine. Back then, no one thought much about efficiency. The freedom of the open road felt worth every gallon. Under the hood, the engineering was straightforward and honest. You could pop the latch and see the ground beneath the engine. There was space to work, even for a shade tree mechanic in the driveway. Belts, hoses, spark plugs, all within reach. It was a time when an oil change or a carburetor adjustment was just part of weekend life, a quiet act of care that kept the family's adventures rolling. Some wagons even came with towing packages, their engines tuned to handle the strain of pulling boats, campers, or horse trailers. For families who spent summers at the lake or weekends at the campground, that capability was more than a convenience. It was freedom in mechanical form. Looking back now, those big, simple engines feel almost like living things. They had personalities. You knew their rhythms, their little quirks. Maybe your wagon had a slight hesitation on cold mornings, or a particular note in its exhaust when you eased off the throttle. These were the small, human details that made the car feel less like an appliance and more like a companion. Today, when we think about performance, we often think about speed, lap times, or 0 to 60 numbers. But in the age of the great American station wagon, performance meant something quieter. The ability to take a family anywhere they wanted to go, to do it without strain, and to make the journey as much a part of the story as the destination. And under those long hoods, in the deep rumble of a well-tuned V8, was the steady reminder that the road was always waiting, and you had the power to follow it. From the outside, the American station wagon of the late 1960s and early 1970s looked untouchable. Sales were strong. Driveways across the country gleamed with their long, polished flanks, and every major automaker had a wagon in their lineup. They were icons, not just cars, but fixtures in the American dream. But behind the showroom glass and beneath that wide expanse of chrome and paint, the first hairline cracks were beginning to show. The trouble wasn't with demand. Far from it. Families still lined up to buy these cars, and each new model year brought updated trim, fresh styling, and more clever ways to carry everything a household could imagine. The real problem lay in the cold, quiet math of the balance sheets. Building a wagon cost more than building a sedan. The longer frame, the reinforced rear suspension, the more complex roof structure, all added weight, material, and hours of labor. The wide rear tailgates and intricate window mechanisms weren't just flashy design touches. They were expensive to produce and assemble. Yet, on the dealer lot, wagons were rarely priced much higher than their sedan counterparts. Automakers knew why. The station wagon was a family purchase, and families were price-sensitive. Push the sticker too high, and buyers might settle for a smaller car, or a used model, or simply make do with what they already had. So, manufacturers kept the price gap narrow, accepting slimmer profit margins in exchange for volume sales. In theory, this should have balanced out. Sell enough wagons, and the profits add up. But in practice, the extra cost of building them meant each one contributed less to the bottom line than the sedans rolling off the same assembly lines. And sedans, thanks to their simpler shapes and lighter materials, were the real moneymakers. Still, automakers couldn't afford not to build wagons. By the mid-1960s, they accounted for a double-digit share of the U.S. car market. For many families, they weren't a luxury. They were a necessity. Dealers relied on them to bring customers through the door. Fathers walked in with a trade-in sedan. Mothers compared the cargo space to the week's worth of groceries. And the kids, well, they were already picking out their seat in the way back, but there was a quiet tension in the boardrooms. Executives saw the margins shrinking. Engineers were told to find cost savings without losing the comfort and capability buyers expected. In some cases, this meant substituting less expensive materials. Thinner chrome trim, vinyl instead of real wood inlays, simplified tailgate hardware. To most buyers, these changes were invisible, but to those who had owned earlier models, the differences could be felt. And yet, year after year, the wagons kept coming. The demand was too strong, the image too ingrained in American culture to simply walk away. It was as if the automakers knew they were selling more than a product. They were selling the idea of a life well lived. A life where weekends meant the open road, where you could load up the back without thinking twice, where the car wasn't just transportation, but a part of the family's story. Still, the numbers didn't lie. The cracks in the chrome weren't from wear or weather. They were from the strain of an industry balancing the heart of the American dream against the hard edge of economics. And for the moment, the dream was still winning. But the pressure was there, quiet and constant, waiting for the right moment to press harder. No one could see it yet, but that moment was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't be styling or engineering, that brought the station wagon to its knees. It would be the world beyond the factory walls, a world that was about to change in ways no one could ignore. By the early 1970s, the American station wagon seemed to have weathered every storm. It had survived shifting tastes, material changes, and even the quiet pressure of shrinking profits. It was still the go-to family car, stretching long across driveways in the suburbs, its chrome catching the afternoon sun. But in 1973, the threat that came wasn't from an engineer's drafting table or a competitor's new model. It came from halfway around the world. That autumn, the news spread first in headlines and radio broadcasts. The price of oil was going up, way up. By winter, the reality hit home. Gasoline, once so cheap you hardly noticed the cost of filling a tank, had quadrupled in price. Drivers found themselves sitting in lines at gas stations that stretched around the block, engines idling, or sometimes shut off entirely to save every drop. In some towns, people waited hours for the chance to buy just a few gallons for the American station wagon, those long, heavy V8-powered machines. It was a gut punch. These were cars built in an age when gasoline was abundant and affordable, when no one thought twice about driving hundreds of miles on a whim. 10 to 12 miles per gallon had never seemed like a problem. Now, it felt like a burden. Families who had once loved the wagon's endless space and smooth ride began to see it through different eyes. A weekend trip to the lake or the grandparents' house no longer felt carefree. Every mile had a price, and that price was climbing. In the driveway, the wagon still looked the same, still handsome, still capable. But inside, there was a quiet reckoning. Parents began talking about fuel economy over the dinner table. Some started driving less, combining errands into a single trip, or leaving the wagon parked in favor of a smaller, thriftier second car. Others began to wonder if they needed something different altogether. Automakers scrambled. They advertised more efficient versions of their wagons, promised lighter builds, and experimented with smaller engines. But the truth was, you couldn't make a 5,000-pound steel land yacht into an economy car without changing what made it a wagon in the first place. Its size, its strength, its comfort. Those were the very things that now worked against it. The crisis also revealed something deeper. How dependent the American lifestyle had become on cheap fuel. The wide-open highways, the sprawling suburbs, the idea that every family needed a big, capable car. All of it was built on the assumption that gasoline would always be plentiful. When that assumption cracked, so did the foundation of the station wagon's dominance. For many Americans, the 1973 oil crisis is remembered not just for the long lines and high prices, but for the feeling it left behind. A sense that something permanent had shifted. It was as if the golden age of carefree driving had been put on notice. The station wagon, once a symbol of freedom, now carried the weight of every gallon it burned. And while the crisis would eventually ease, the damage was done. Buyers began to look elsewhere, to smaller cars, to imports, to anything that promised more miles for less money. The wagon, with all its virtues, suddenly felt like a relic from another time. It hadn't disappeared yet, far from it. But for the first time since its rise to prominence, the station wagon was no longer the obvious choice for America's families. The world had changed, and the long road ahead would only get harder. The oil crisis may have shaken the station wagon's confidence, but what came next began to chip away at its very soul. By the mid-1970s, it wasn't just the price of gasoline that was changing the way Americans drove. It was the law. New federal regulations, born from growing concerns about air quality and public safety, landed squarely on the shoulders of automakers. The Clean Air Act meant that tailpipe emissions had to be reduced dramatically. For the big V8 engines that powered most full-size wagons, that meant lower compression ratios, smog control equipment, and, inevitably, less horsepower. The same cars that had once surged down the highway with effortless power now felt muted. Their once deep rumble softened into something less confident. In living rooms across America, conversation shifted. People spoke of cars that just didn't have the get-up and go they used to. For wagon owners who remembered the smooth pull of a powerful engine, it was like watching a proud friend grow old before their eyes. Safety regulations brought more changes. Steel reinforcements, crash standards, and new bumper designs added weight, but didn't bring back the lost performance. Fuel economy standards were introduced, pushing manufacturers to think smaller, lighter. But the full-size wagon was built on the very idea of size. Long wheelbases, wide bodies, and space for the whole family, plus the dog. The more regulators pushed toward efficiency, the more the big wagon found itself out of step with the times. And then came the economic reality. The mid to late 70s were a tough time for Detroit. Sales were shifting, costs were rising, and the pressure to compete with smaller, more efficient imports was mounting. For Chrysler, the decision came first and hardest. In 1978, they walked away from the full-size wagon market entirely. It was a quiet but telling moment, a sign that the golden age of the American land yacht was truly ending. On the streets, the changes were visible. The massive wood-paneled sides were still there, but the stance seemed a little lower, the engines a little less sure. Even the styling was changing. Sharper edges, squarer lines, hints that designers were trying to make the wagon look more modern, perhaps even more economical. But to the families who had grown up with them, the essence was slipping away. Yet for all the pressures, the wagon still had its loyalists. For many, there was no other vehicle that could do what it did. Road trips, moving days, ball games, vacations. It still carried everything and everyone without complaint. But these were the years when the cracks in the chrome grew wider. The regulations weren't temporary. The world wasn't going back to the days of limitless horsepower and cheap fuel. In hindsight, those late 70s wagons stand as a bridge between two eras, the last of the truly big family haulers and the beginning of something leaner, more restrained. They were still handsome, still capable, but they were no longer untouchable. The tide had turned, and the station wagon, for the first time in decades, was no longer riding at the crest. It's a bittersweet chapter to remember. Progress, in the name of cleaner air and safer roads, was necessary. Few would argue otherwise. But for those who loved the feeling of a big V8 wagon pulling strong under an open sky, something essential had been lost. The station wagon would carry on into the 1980s, but it would never again be quite the same. By the early 1980s, the American station wagon had been through a decade of storms, oil shocks, government regulations, shrinking engines, and shifting tastes. It was still here, still loyal to the families it served, but its crown was slipping. And in 1984, a new challenger rolled quietly onto the scene, not with the roar of a V8, but with the quiet confidence of something designed entirely for the modern American family. They called it the minivan. It wasn't glamorous, not in the way a wood-paneled country squire had been in its prime. But the Dodge Caravan and Plymouth Voyager arrived with a promise the wagon could no longer keep. More space and a smaller footprint, better fuel economy, and the kind of easy drivability that didn't intimidate the average parent. For young families, it was like someone had finally listened. Sliding side doors meant no more contortions to load children into cramped back seats. A tall roofline meant you could stand almost straight inside, fastening a toddler into a car seat without bumping your head. And the cargo space. Oh, the cargo space. Swallowed camping gear, sports bags, groceries, and the occasional flat-pack furniture without a second thought. The front-wheel drive layout, borrowed from compact cars, made the minivan far more nimble than the big wagons ever were. Parking in tight suburban shopping centers was no longer a sweaty-palmed ordeal. And under the hood, the smaller, more efficient engines sipped gas rather than gulped it, a trait that felt almost revolutionary after the fuel-guzzling 1970s. In commercials, the message was clear. This was not your parents' station wagon. Where the wagon had been a rolling extension of the family home, the minivan was presented as a kind of mobile command center for the busy modern household. It was about getting kids to soccer practice, making the big grocery run, heading to the lake for the weekend, all without the compromises of the past. And people bought in, quickly. In the driveway of a brand new home in a just-paved subdivision, a young mother could stand next to her new caravan, sliding the door open with one smooth pull, the kids tumbling out with backpacks and laughter. Her husband, perhaps still in his work shirt, could unload the cooler from the back without ducking under a tailgate. Everything felt easier. For the station wagon, this was more than just competition. It was a shift in identity. The wagon had always been about combining passenger comfort with cargo hauling practicality. But the minivan did both better, and without the cultural baggage that the wagon now carried. The long, wood-paneled sides had started to feel dated, even quaint, to a generation that had grown up riding backward in the way back. By the late 1980s, the numbers told the story. Minivan sales soared, and wagon sales began their slow, steady decline. The Caravan and Voyager became fixtures of American life, as much a part of the suburban landscape as basketball hoops above garage doors and mailboxes shaped like little barns. And yet, for all its practicality, the minivan lacked a certain romance. It didn't turn heads in quite the same way. There was no equivalent to that moment on a summer road trip when a child in the way back would wave to a truck driver and be rewarded with the long, joyful blast of an air horn. No wood grain glinting in the sunlight. No rear-facing seat where you could watch the world recede, mile by mile. But for most families, practicality won. The wagon's long reign as America's family chariot was ending, not with a crash, but with a polite handover of the keys. The new era had arrived, boxy, spacious, efficient, and utterly devoted to the job. The station wagon would carry on for a while yet, but from this point forward, it would never again be the unquestioned king of the road. By the mid-1980s, the station wagon's long shadow stretched thin across the American road. It had carried the weight of the family car market for decades, but now another new contender was rolling in, this one wearing a different kind of promise. In 1984, two vehicles arrived that would quietly, and then very quickly, change the way Americans thought about getting from here to there: the Jeep Cherokee and the Toyota 4Runner. They were taller, more rugged, and they wore the dust of adventure like a badge of honor. And a few years later, in 1990, Ford would release the Explorer, sealing the deal. These weren't just cars. They were statements. The station wagon had always been about domestic life, getting the kids to school, hauling groceries, heading to grandma's for Sunday dinner. The SUV suggested something different. It hinted at trails that led beyond the pavement, weekends in the mountains, fishing trips down a rutted gravel road, or a sunrise over a campsite that no sedan could reach. And even if most of these SUVs would never leave the smooth blacktop, the image was intoxicating. The Cherokee was compact compared to the lumbering wagons of the 70s, but it looked purposeful, boxy, upright, capable. The 4Runner carried Toyota's reputation for reliability, wrapped in a body that seemed ready for both the school drop-off line and the open desert. And when the Explorer hit the market, it brought SUV styling to a size and price point that made sense for the average suburban family. In a way, the SUV was a spiritual successor to the wagon. It still had space for kids and cargo. It could still swallow camping gear, folding chairs, and the family dog. But it added something the wagon couldn't: height. From the driver's seat of an SUV, you looked out over traffic instead of across it. You felt less like you were riding in the car and more like you were commanding it. And for a culture that was growing restless, that mattered. Television commercials of the time leaned hard into the idea. A father and son crossing a shallow river in a Cherokee, water curling up around the wheels. A family unloading bikes from the back of a 4Runner on a sunlit forest trail. The Explorer parked in front of a cabin, pine trees framing the scene. It wasn't about errands. It was about possibilities. Meanwhile, the wagon, even the sportiest versions, looked a little tired in comparison. Its low profile and long, flat roof had once been symbols of style and utility. Now, next to the upright stance of an SUV, they seemed rooted in yesterday. By the early 1990s, the sales charts told the truth that many wagon loyalists didn't want to face. Families who might once have driven off the dealer lot in a country squire or a caprice estate were now choosing Explorers, Pathfinders, and Grand Cherokees. And unlike the minivan, which had won over buyers through sheer practicality, the SUV brought along an aspirational edge. It was about image as much as function. The sense that you could leave for work on Monday morning, but if the mood struck, you could keep driving until the road turned to dirt and the mountains rose in the distance. For some, that promise was worth more than miles per gallon or a few extra cubic feet of cargo space. And so, the SUV wave rolled in, not as a sudden flood, but as a steady tide, rising higher each year. The station wagon, still sturdy and still capable, found itself pushed further toward the edges of the market. It wasn't that it couldn't do the job anymore. It was that Americans had fallen in love with the idea of what the SUV could do. Even if most of those dreams never left the driveway, the wagon's era was fading, and the SUV, with its stance, its swagger, and its promise of freedom, was just getting started. By the time the 1990s arrived, the once proud American station wagon was no longer the centerpiece of the family driveway. It had been the faithful workhorse of countless road trips, the backdrop to decades of vacations, little league carpools, and grocery runs. But its moment in the sun was slipping away. What replaced it wasn't just one competitor. It was a new era of automotive desire. The minivan, which had already carved a deep niche through sheer practicality, continued to win over parents who valued sliding doors and flexible seating. SUVs, with their higher stance and rugged image, had captured the imagination of a younger generation who dreamed less about neatly packed luggage and more about weekend escapes into the wild. For the station wagon, it was a slow fading, not a dramatic collapse, but a steady drift toward the margins. By the late 90s, only a handful of American wagons remained. The Ford Taurus wagon, once a modern answer to the family hauler, lingered for a while, but it was fighting a battle it could not win. The younger buyers, the ones starting families, buying their first new vehicles, were rarely looking in the wagon's direction, and in 2005, Ford quietly ended production of the Taurus wagon. There was no parade, no farewell campaign, just an absence in the lineup where the wagon had once stood. 3 years later, the Ford Focus wagon followed it into the history books. What was left were mostly foreign nameplates, European and Japanese wagons that appealed to a smaller, more specific crowd. But the big, all-American, wood-paneled family cruiser, that chapter was closed. In its last years, the station wagon wore a kind of quiet dignity. It was still practical, still comfortable, still able to swallow camping gear, a week's worth of groceries, or a few pieces of furniture without complaint. But the culture had shifted. Utility was no longer enough. Buyers wanted a certain image, the idea that their vehicle said something about who they were, not just what it could carry. The wagon had been built for an era when the family car was a kind of shared living space. When kids sat in the rear-facing seat making faces at the cars behind, when the luggage rack on top was almost a permanent fixture in summer, when you could roll down the windows and feel the warm wind of August spill through every inch of the cabin. But in the 2000s, those memories lived mostly in photographs and fading home videos. Dealership lots were filled with high-roofed minivans and SUVs with names that suggested distant mountains, open prairies, and unexplored trails. It wasn't that the wagon had failed its drivers. Far from it. It had done exactly what it was designed to do, and it had done it well for over half a century. But tastes change. Dreams shift. And sometimes, the very thing that once symbolized the ideal family life becomes, in the eyes of the next generation, a relic. In the end, the American station wagon didn't go out with a roar. It simply rolled quietly into the background, replaced by vehicles that promised something newer, taller, or more adventurous. Yet for those who had grown up with one parked in their driveway, there was, and still is, a pang of nostalgia whenever they spot one today. Maybe it's the sight of the long roofline, or the faint trace of faux wood paneling on the side. Maybe it's the way a well-kept wagon still looks ready to load up the kids and head for the shore. They may be rare now, but in the hearts of many, the station wagon never really left. It just waits quietly in the rearview mirror of American memory, a reminder of a slower, simpler time when the road ahead was wide, the gas was cheap, and the journey itself was the destination. Even as the American station wagon slipped into memory, the story didn't end entirely. Across the Atlantic, and in small pockets of the U.S. market, the wagon still lived on, not as a fading relic, but as a refined traveler. In Europe, it never carried the same suburban stereotype it had in the States. There, it was often seen as a mark of practicality blended with elegance, something driven not just by parents on school runs, but by architects, photographers, or anyone who valued space without sacrificing style. Audi called theirs the Avant, Volvo the Estate. BMW simply let the numbers do the talking. Mercedes-Benz, with its understated grace, continued to offer long-roofed versions of its sedans, all quietly confident in their usefulness. And while these cars still made their way across the ocean, they did so in small numbers, tucked into the corners of dealership lots, away from the towering SUVs that dominated the showrooms. For the Americans who still loved a wagon, these imports became something of a secret handshake. They were for people who remembered what a long roof was really for. A weekend's worth of luggage, a row of bicycles strapped on top, or a dog stretched out in the back, happily asleep as the highway rolled by. And then there was Subaru. The Outback, launched in the mid-1990s, was a wagon by every practical measure, but the company never quite called it that. They spoke instead of crossover versatility, a phrase that eased it into the SUV boom while still keeping the heart of the wagon alive. Its raised suspension, rugged cladding, and all-wheel drive made it feel ready for adventure. But to those who looked closely, the proportions and spirit were pure wagon. It worked. The Outback found homes in mountain towns, coastal villages, and quiet suburbs alike. You could see one parked outside a ski lodge in Colorado, dusted with fresh snow, or idling at a farmer's market in Oregon, its cargo area loaded with flowers and fresh bread. It became the unassuming heir to a legacy most people didn't even realize it was carrying. Even so, the American market had changed. These European and Japanese holdouts weren't the centerpiece of family advertising campaigns anymore. They weren't the stars of glossy summer brochures filled with picnic baskets and sandy beach scenes. Instead, they existed for the ones who sought them out, those who knew that a low center of gravity still made for a better drive, that a long roof meant fewer compromises, that there was a certain timelessness in a shape that had served families for generations. In their own quiet way, these wagons kept the flame alive. They showed that the idea hadn't been wrong, only the image. That perhaps the problem wasn't the wagon itself, but the way it had been marketed, trapped in a picture of an America that no longer existed. On certain mornings, you might still catch one gliding by on the interstate, an Audi Avant with its polished roof rails catching the early light, or a Volvo V70, its rear windows filled with the silhouettes of sleeping children. And if you were once a wagon kid yourself, you might feel it, that sudden tug of memory, the way the scenery looked when you watched it roll past backwards from the rearmost seat, the smell of the car's interior after a long day at the beach, the sound of the tailgate thumping shut before a family trip. They are rare sightings now, like spotting an old friend in a crowded place. But for those who notice, they are reminders. The long roof hasn't vanished. It's just wearing a different passport and perhaps a different name. For all its quirks, the American station wagon was never about perfection. It was never the fastest or the most fuel efficient or the most glamorous. It was about something else entirely. A feeling, a way of living that was woven into the quiet threads of everyday life. To step into a family wagon was to step into a moving scrapbook. The back seat smelled faintly of sunscreen from a summer at the beach years ago, or of pine needles from last year's Christmas tree ride home. There might be a faded road map still folded in the glove box, its creases worn from the hands that traced long journeys before smartphones ever existed. The carpet in the cargo area might still bear the ghost of a coffee stain from a hurried morning departure, or the faint scratches from a dog who knew that space was his. The wagon was not simply a way to get somewhere. It was where life happened along the way. It was where siblings whispered secret jokes on the way to Grandma's house, their faces pressed to the glass as the countryside rolled by. It was where a parent's arm instinctively reached across the front seat in a sudden stop, long before airbags took on that job. It was the place where a family sat in silence together, watching rain bead and streak across the windows, the soft hum of the engine filling the spaces between thoughts. And then there was that rear-facing seat, a design quirk that could make you feel like the world was moving away from you instead of toward you. For a child, it was a portal to endless games of making faces at drivers behind, to quiet daydreams while telephone poles and farm fields slid out of sight. That seat was never about efficiency or safety ratings. It was about magic, about giving a child a view that belonged to them alone. On summer evenings, you could see wagons lined up along little league fields, their tailgates open like invitations, coolers of lemonade, folding chairs pulled out from the back, parents leaning against the bumper, chatting with neighbors as kids chased each other in the grass. The wagon wasn't just a car in those moments. It was part of the scenery, part of the ritual. Even its imperfections became part of its charm. The squeak of a sticky tailgate hinge, the way the fake wood paneling would fade just a little unevenly under the sun, the clunky way the back door closed, never quite as smooth as you wanted. They were the kind of flaws you forgave because they belonged to something you loved. For those who grew up with one, the wagon holds a place in memory that no SUV can quite touch. An SUV might have more horsepower, a minivan might be more practical, but neither carries the same kind of quiet intimacy, the shared warmth of a family gathered inside one long, low roof on a cold morning, or the laughter echoing in that cavernous back end on a long summer drive. In the end, the emotional legacy of the station wagon isn't about automotive history at all. It's about the people who filled it and the lives it carried. It's about journeys where the destination mattered less than the company. It's about a time when a car could be more than a purchase. It could be a member of the family. Today, when one passes by, maybe in the hands of a collector or tucked into the corner of a driveway, it can stir something quiet and unexpected. You might not even notice it at first. But then you catch a glimpse of those long lines, that roof stretching out toward a time when life seemed just a little slower. And for a moment, you remember, not just the wagon itself, but the way it felt to be inside, watching the road unwind in both directions at once. When you look back at the story of the American station wagon, it's tempting to see it only as a rise and fall, a product that bloomed in a certain time, then quietly disappeared from the roads. But tucked inside that arc is something more meaningful. It's a reminder of just how quickly the things we think are permanent can fade, and how often our choices are shaped by something far deeper than simple need. In the 1950s and 60s, the station wagons seemed untouchable. Families bought them because they made sense. They could carry the kids, the luggage, the dog, and still have room for groceries on the way home. They were practical in a way no sedan could match. But their success wasn't just about practicality. It was about the way they fit into the image of the life people wanted. The wide chrome grille, the stretch of that long roof, the suggestion that adventure was always just a weekend away. By the late 1970s, the picture began to shift. Fuel prices spiked, regulations tightened, and other options began to appear. People didn't stop needing a family car. They just started wanting something that looked different. The minivan came along with sliding doors and a fresh, modern feel. SUVs promised a ruggedness, a sense of exploration, even if most never strayed far from suburban driveways. The wagon hadn't suddenly become less useful, but in the space of a single generation, it went from being the symbol of family life to something that felt out of step. That's the first lesson the wagon leaves behind. Usefulness alone isn't enough to survive. People don't simply buy what works best on paper. They buy what feels right, what reflects the version of themselves they hope to live out. In the end, emotion often outruns logic. The second lesson is about change, how fast it comes, and how quietly it settles in. In 1958, nearly 1 in 5 cars sold in America was a station wagon. By the early 2000s, you could drive all day and never see one. There was no single moment when everyone decided, this is over. The change happened in small, almost invisible steps. One more SUV in the neighbor's driveway. One more ad showing a smiling family climbing into a minivan instead. And slowly, the shape of the American road transformed. The third lesson is more personal, and maybe the most bittersweet. It's about the way certain things carry meaning only because of the memories we've attached to them. For a child in the back of a wagon, it wasn't about market share or profit margins. It was about the rhythm of the tires on a long stretch of highway. It was about your father's voice singing along to the radio, or your mother's hand passing back a sandwich. Those moments didn't depend on whether the car was technically the best choice. They happened because it was the car you had, the one that was there to carry you through them. We live in a world now where our choices feel endless and where change comes faster than we can catch it. But the station wagon story reminds us that some of the best parts of life aren't about chasing the next thing. They're about making the most of what's in front of us, even if it's a little worn, a little dated, or not quite perfect. It's easy to measure the life of a car in years, models, and miles. But the real measure of the wagon's life is in the laughter that bounced around its cabin, the quiet talks on night drives home, and the countless miles that brought families closer together. Those are the things no sales chart can capture and no fuel crisis can take away. In the end, the wagon teaches us something about ourselves, that we're drawn to what feels like home, even if it's just a bench seat and a stretch of vinyl paneling. That we'll follow the pull of an image, even when logic points us somewhere else. And that the road, no matter what we're driving, is always less about the machine and more about the people it carries. Maybe that's the greatest lesson of all, that what we remember isn't the car itself, but the life we lived inside it. There was a time when the American station wagon wasn't just a car. It was a part of the family, not in the sentimental way we sometimes speak of machines, but in the very real way it held our lives together. Mile after mile, year after year, it wasn't there to impress the neighbors or make a statement. It was there to take you where you needed to go and to bring you home again. Weddings, graduations, camping trips, Sunday drives to visit grandparents. The wagon was the quiet witness to it all. It waited patiently in the driveway, ready for whatever the day might bring, and perhaps that's what made it so special. It never tried to be the center of attention. It wasn't flashy. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It was steady, dependable, comfortable. It asked for nothing more than regular gas and a little care. And in return, it gave you freedom, safety, and the room to carry everything and everyone that mattered most. When we look back now, it's tempting to remember only the quirks. The faux wood paneling that peeled in the sun. The heavy tailgate that seemed to slam shut too fast. The way the rear seat always felt a little warmer in the summer because the air never quite reached it. But time has a way of softening the rough edges. Those imperfections fade, and what remains are the moments we lived in between the miles. The station wagon was never about status. It didn't speak to power or wealth. It spoke to togetherness, to the belief that life was richer when experienced side by side, with everyone piled in, looking out at the same stretch of road. And when it was gone, something else went with it. We gained sleeker shapes, better mileage, more advanced technology, but we lost the slow, gentle rhythm of a family trip. We lost the simple joy of turning around in the rear-facing seat to wave at the cars behind us. We lost the kind of quiet that came from knowing the road was long, but we had nowhere else to be. Sometimes, I think the station wagon disappeared because it wasn't selling a dream anymore. The dream had changed. People wanted adventure, boldness, individuality. They traded the long, low silhouette for the high stance of an SUV, for the sliding doors of a minivan. And those vehicles served their purpose too. But they didn't quite hold the same soul. What we lost was more than a car. We lost a piece of our shared language, the one made up of summer road trips, roadside picnics, and the sound of the tires humming through an endless night drive home. If you've ever ridden in a wagon, you know that memory lives somewhere inside you still. Maybe it's the smell of the upholstery on a hot July afternoon. Maybe it's the way the map would slide across the dashboard when your father took a turn a little too quickly. Maybe it's the sound of your mother's voice, softly singing along with the radio as the highway stretched on ahead. Will the station wagon ever return? Perhaps in name, perhaps in spirit. But even if it never rolls back into our driveways, it will always live in that quiet corner of memory. The one we visit when we think about the best parts of where we've been. And so we leave the road here for tonight. The light is fading. The air is warm, and somewhere, under a row of old maple trees, there's a station wagon parked in the shade. Its engine is silent now, its tires resting after so many years of carrying the people it loved. It's waiting, not for the next errand or trip to the grocery store, but for the next journey in our minds. In dreams, the road is always open, the tank is always full, and the people we love are already inside. Thank you for traveling with me tonight, for remembering this piece of Americana that once carried so much of our lives. I hope, wherever you are, you find that same sense of comfort and connection, whether it's in a car, a place, or the company of the people closest to you. Sleep well, my friend. May your road be smooth, your heart be light, and your dreams take you somewhere worth remembering. Good night.